What's up, family? Thank you for tuning in. This is Dhane Diesil. Welcome to Billionaire Belief. We've got another reaction video lined up for you today. The title is How America's Wealth Racial Gap Began. So it's this video by Bloomberg Quicktakes. I think it'll be pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and dive on in. Getting started.
The fact is that millions of Negroes, as a result of centuries of denial and neglect, have been left bootless.
Good point, Dr. King. That was actually
It
really
is a
good point.
cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps.
Another good point. How you gonna lift
At
yourself
the
up
dawn
if
of
you ain't got no
emancipation,
boots?
the total black wealth in America was about 0.5%. Today, that number is between 1 to 2%. So there's
Not much
been
room. I mean, not
practically
much.
no movement.
Exactly, no movement at all.
I mean, the most pernicious form of the racial wealth gap is when we take people, human beings, as capital for others, as being an asset by which others can be enriched, can accumulate, can pass down
fences back
resources
then,
from
man.
one generation to the other.
They find themselves impoverished aliens in this affluent society. And that is a great deal that the society can and must do if the Negro is to gain the economic security that he needs.
The paycheck. Let's talk about the paycheck, ladies and gentlemen. This should be pretty interesting. Let's see what they got to say.
The origins of the racial wealth gap begins when black people entered the shores of the United States as chattel capital.
It's a
There were
mystery
two
for some of
forms in
y'all.
which black people served as capital. The uncompensated labor that they provided, but their sheer bodies themselves could be traded and stood as a source of wealth and wealth building.
So that's actually a good point right there. Like he says too, basically the labor as well as the body itself. So human capital. I've talked to, or I've said, made some comments about this in some other, realms of the digital streets. But yeah, human capital. Like that's why family is so important. Because like I said, by having a solid nuclear family base in a sense, husband, wife, and then children, that husband and wife, the children become the human capital of that family for them to be able to build some wealth through the labor and then just the human being themselves, because within us, we have our minds, and that's what intellectual property, and that's where intellectual property lives. So that's a good point. So think about that. They had two forms of capital from the slaves, the labor, as well as just the human capital itself, the body.
For white people.
So the body.
The enslavement of black
The
people
labor.
in America is what made the U.S. economy grow into the powerhouse that it is today.
Key point. The enslavement is what made America the economic superpower it is today. So if it hadn't been for the enslavement of African Americans, black people, Negroes, whatever label works for you, that was, as they say, that that straw that breaks the camel's back in a sense, or that one thing. Slavery was that one thing for America that gave it the economic power that it has till today. People are still reaping the benefits.
Even though most of this farming activity was going on in the southern part of the United States, businesses all over the country were involved in this. Insurance companies insured the slaves themselves. There were even slave-backed securities that could be traded by financial institutions.
So it's big business.
In essence, Slavery encompassed nearly every
Everybody
part
had
of the
their
U.S.
hands in it.
economy at this point.
And like I said before, they're still reaping the benefits
At the start of the
today.
Civil War, each slave was worth an average of $1,000. That came to $4 billion at that point because there were around 4 million slaves in the U.S.
Wow.
In today's money, that comes to $42 trillion. And $42 trillion is about double the size of the current U.S.
So, $42 trillion solely in slaves. Like, that's what slavery represented to the slave masters and to the American economy, the government, all that. They all had their hands in on it, but $42 trillion in assets. That's what, the black slave was to the America at the end of the day, to America. Like everybody was in on it. So $42 trillion. Think about, I know we can't fathom what that looks like. We really, 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 really can't. But $42 trillion. Of course you're going to be of course you're going to be the economic superpower if you have $42 trillion in assets at the end of the day. Like, it's basic math. You feel me? Like, so that's crazy. 42 trillion. Woo!
This economy.
Excuse me.
With the 13th Amendment that freed slaves, the point is that that's not enough. When you've had centuries of literally bondage imposed upon a people, if you want true justice or true freedom, there needed to be not only that freedom from bondage, but actual accompanying of resources so that people could pursue their livelihood. Expecting a people to thrive and flourish without compensation for all that unjust harm really just set up a system for oppression and a system that was unjust.
Excellent point. How can you expect a man and woman to survive if they don't have the basic means of survival, which in this case we're talking about income, paycheck? Like how? and that's another way, as some people say, the system. Now, yes, the system is what it is, and these factors are still in play because the system is still there. But I'll say that there is a sense of personal responsibility that I believe that we all do have as individuals to ourselves, to provide ourselves the best that we are capable of providing ourselves as individuals, irregardless of any outside people, outside relatives, family, just to yourself. You know what I'm saying? That's a personal belief. But I believe that is what it is. So, irregardless of all the traps that lay in front of me, like I still gotta figure out a way to move forward. So, and we're resilient, you know what I'm saying? Like my skin folk, my kin folk, we have been resilient, we've been able to be here till today, but this is real stuff, you feel me? Real stuff. Real. Real. So let's continue.
Toward the end of the Civil War, General William Tecumseh Sherman made a promise to slaves that as soon as the war was over, they would be granted 40 acres of land and a mule.
40 acres of
This idea of giving land had a dual purpose. People that supported it saw it as a way to both free the formerly enslaved from their old masters and as a way to dilute the power of these Southern landowners. But a few months later, President Abraham Lincoln was shot and killed. His vice president, Johnson, swiftly got rid of this promise.
When Andrew Johnson vetoed the Freedmen's Bill, he said, look, this is a white man's government. So that was the impetus. But also use this idea that the government doesn't give away land, this is capitalism. And the idea that this is a free market and laissez-faire was very much used to undercut claims of the 40 acres. While at the same time, the government is giving away free land out west through the Homestead Act.
That's exactly
the
what I was about.
Homestead Acts were a series of bills meant
exactly
to encourage
what I was about to
settlement
say.
of the American West. In all, 270 million acres were given out as part of the bills. That land,
270
which accounts
million.
for about 10% of the entire country, was mostly stolen from Native Americans, and most of the 1.5 million Americans that benefited from the Homestead Acts were white.
They were literally giveaways that provided white people
freebies.
Ultimately a key ingredient to build wealth, and that's capital itself.
So freebies, they got freebies. The very thing that they claim the people that they had enslaved didn't deserve, because that's not what the government is about. We're capitalists. You know, we earn and we pull ourselves up our bootstraps. The very people who said that are giving away land to others that are not enslaved. System.
And by design, black people were not included. The Homestead Act is a dramatic indicator of U.S. government facilitating the accumulation for white people and not facilitating it for black people, but it's one of many. The Homestead Act fits into a larger context that throughout our United States history, well beyond slavery. You know, we think about racial repression and we think that with emancipation, that all of a sudden we were a free country. But a bigger point to make is that if we think about a middle class, a middle white asset building class, it was
like the Emancipation Proclamation, in a sense, is transferred custody of the slaves.
What little economic successes black people were able to have at this time often spurred a lot of resentment among whites. This led to thousands of lynchings of black people and other violent attacks, sometimes on entire black neighborhoods and communities.
My name is Roy Woodle, and I'm not ashamed to be a Klansman. Amen.
Amen.
This was in the time of
that kid is probably still alive.
In the time of, rising Klan, and in the time where white supremacy was gaining this pseudo-scientific legitimacy.
It is the case that throughout history, not only have blacks not been permitted to accumulate land, capital, and other forms of resource to the same extent as whites, but when they were able to overcome barriers and accumulate those resources, it's always been subject to outright terror, outright seizure, because we did not have the codification that comes along with government to protect the resources of black people in the same way that it was protected for white people.
So a good point right there. Even though black people weren't permitted to have or to build wealth because of government policy, but they also were terrorized for having it, for the ones that, once again, the ones that did persevere, that did pull these imaginary bootstraps up and make something out of nothing. Even those people were terrorized, like they said. So through policy and terror, black people weren't allowed to build wealth at the magnitude of their Caucasian or white counterparts. So we talk about where does he, like, how are black
Also,
people's
for example,
wealth, how is this wealth gap?
In the 1900s, it was oil
This is how.
with a lot
Why is
of
there a
wealth
wealth
that was
gap?
in that community, and so
This
they
is
built
how.
the Greenwood District, and the central part of the city was this black church. It was very ornate, beautiful. These places are called the Black Wall Street, where it
That
wasn't
brother
just
right
a
there.
market. There was land holding.
Suited and booted.
The thing that happened was that the racial resentment grew.
Racial resentment.
There were, bombings and really just a complete destruction of that city, and very much stemming from that resentment.
So that's another good point too. So people always ask, like, well, how is it going to change? Or what can we do to change? And outside of just, us as black people doing what we got to do anyway, one of the bigger challenges is going to be, just like she just said, the racial resentment. Just a group of people looking at black people do what they got to do to ensure prosperity and longevity for their families, are just feeling real bitter indignation. Crazy bitter indignation towards that activity. to the point where they want to terrorize, they want to steal, pillage, kill, ravage. And they're able to. And nothing's going to happen. So we ask ourselves, like, how are black people so far behind? Why are black people so far behind? They're lazy. They don't want to work. They waste their money. Albeit some of that is true. A bigger reason, though, is this. This is the bigger reason. Policy and terror. Like, that's the real issue at hand. What are we going to do about that?
In that one day, Black Wall Street was destroyed and 10,000 Tulsans were displaced. There's even evidence that World War I bomber planes were used to burn the town.
Government. Policy.
In Tulsa alone, the property damage amounts to about $200 million in today's money. The Tulsa massacre was not an isolated incident. About 100 of these occurred between the end of the Civil War and the 1940s, destroying a substantial amount of Black wealth.
On the one hand, those communities are clear examples of the...
Now here's another good point, once again, going back to policy, government. We have seen and we know that because of things like world wars, that after the fact, peace, we good, sign. We know that, America, the government has sent aid to these countries for them to rebuild themselves up, rebuild infrastructure, revitalize the economy, all that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm pretty sure to this day we're still giving aid to some of these countries. I know for sure, Israel is one of those countries, for sure. But we're still giving billions of dollars in aid, to these countries. But we still haven't compensated black folks for the terror and policy that has prohibited them from building their wealth up and accumulating wealth at a rate as their white counterparts.
Ways in which black people have demonstrated they can not only survive, but it can actually thrive. But on the other hand, we romanticize the past. We describe a nostalgia as if we had these kingdoms of gold, when in reality, it was never the case that black people had wealth en masse.
Fact.
That said, left to our own druthers, the wealth gap is not going to be solved.
Slavery itself created a multi-trillion-dollar wealth gap, and the period immediately following slavery didn't do anything to close it. And none of that includes the one thing that most people today can trace their wealth back to: home ownership. Following the Great Depression, Congress passed a series of laws to help the country recover from the economic crisis.
Once again, policy.
Among them was the 1934 National Housing Act. This law, for the first time, made home ownership affordable to working class individuals.
And that was a good thing, except for the fact that it intentionally excluded black people.
Government
and mortgage
policy.
companies did not lend to black people. In fact, the federal government went the other way. Federal government, as well as local governments, they facilitated the process of excluding black people from
This is
these
redlining.
products. And how did they do so? Neighborhoods were redlined.
The government created maps that showed the level of risk by neighborhood. These had different colors, and the riskiest was outlined in red.
This was very much a crude calculus, but sophisticated in a way that they actually had tons of maps across the country. And you would see the way that they mapped out a neighborhood, and they looked at the houses. Is it single family? Is it industrial? Is it farmland? What are the characteristics of the neighborhood? But the number one thing that they looked at is who lives there, right? So they would say, this is a black neighborhood, red line.
And naturally, what would develop? Slums. What would develop? Neighborhood degradation. When you have capital fleeing certain areas and capital being flooded.
So today, we call those areas the ghetto. They've pretty much always been called the ghetto, but the ghetto is what he's talking about right now. The ghetto.
Into areas, the outcomes become obvious.
If you lived in a black neighborhood, And because it was a black neighborhood, you did not get that FHA mortgage, you did not get that GI Bill loan, you did not get the farm loans. So today, the legacy of those laws is that your neighborhood is very much racially coded. This is how racism gets embedded in wealth.
Word came from Capitol Hill that Congress had passed and sent to the White House the Civil Rights Act of 1968. Included in the measure was a landmark open housing bill, which, when fully effective, would forbid discrimination in approximately 80% of all housing offered for rent or for sale in the United States.
The civil rights movement, and in particular the Fair Housing Act of 1968, tried to put an end to that discrimination.
Fair housing for all.
Tried.
All human beings who live in this country is now a part of the American way of life.
But they didn't have much economic power, and they struggled to undo the decades of damage that had already been done. Since that time, the wealth gap has actually widened. In 1967, black families had 1/5 the wealth of white families. Today, that number is 1/7.
And that really is a legacy of the racial wealth gap. It's not just that you have more money in the bank account, your house is higher value. It is also, the opportunities, the ladders up for your kids are different in certain neighborhoods, non-existent in some neighborhoods, and quite frankly, hard to fall off of in other neighborhoods.
This story is not all dismal. Just like policy can be enacted to create these unjust disparities, likewise, policy can be enacted to rectify them.
Policy.
What we need today is a new policy regime that provides that resource in a way that's anti-racist so that we all can have the opportunity for capital accumulation and intergenerational transfers. We need some.
So, Neely Fuller Jr. talks about this. Like, things can change, but it requires the ability and will to change. So, I don't doubt that there is some will to change things, specifically in regards to the racial wealth gap, but ability, is key. And the people with the ability don't think that things need to change. Policy, like you just said, the same way policy was created to, create this environment or to create this gap, this wealth gap, policy can be created to eliminate it. But once again, policy.
An in perpetuity that ensures that as a birthright, no American is excluded from the economic security that comes along with a capital endowment.
There it is. So, it's just like that. It's just that simple. So, ability and will, that's just going to change. That's what's going to make the change, ladies and gentlemen. Ability and will. So individually, we have to have the ability and we have to have the will. So like I keep saying, I don't doubt that people have the will. But once again, ability, individually, that's going to come down to us, obviously, being smart with our money, earn, save, invest. But from a macro perspective, on a big picture perspective, that's going to require some policy changes. So, you feel me? We got our work to do. So now that we have a little bit more perspective on how the racial wealth gap has been created in America, now we have some things or some action steps we can take to fix it. So like I said, ability and will on a macro level, that's what's going to get the change we need. All right. Thanks for tuning in. Dhane Diesil out. Peace. Oh yeah, before I forget, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on the video. It's going to take all of us to make any one of us successful. And we begin with conversation and communication. So make sure you don't forget to tell a friend, to tell a stranger, to tell a friend about us. Peace.